Hello friends, here we are in part 2 of the answer to the question, where can I go to find out what's ahead for our world? I know this is a heavy question because of what we hear on our local newscasts every night, from our world leaders, in our newspaper editorials, from TV gurus, or even from our neighbors or friends. Really no one seems to have the answer. That's why I hope that you were encouraged to hear in last week's message that Jesus' return is ahead, and that is not only good news, but it is the best news that we can hear. That's why I promised that we would move forward this week looking at the answer that Jesus gave to his disciples in response to the question, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? This section is referred to as the Olivet Discourse, which is the name given to the orderly and extended teaching given by Jesus Christ on the Mount of Olives. The subject is the end times and is recorded in Matthew chapter 24 and 25, with parallel passages found in Mark chapter 13 and Luke chapter 21. What I will discuss in this video comes from these three passages. So I hope that you will take the time to turn to those sections to not only confirm that what I'm teaching is true, but to hear for yourself the words of Jesus. Now to the answer to that question asked of Jesus by his disciples as they were looking for a sign of the coming of the end of the age. How I wish I could give you a date, but even Jesus didn't do that. Matter of fact, he actually said in Matthew 24:36, no one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. So maybe that's where we should just stop. But oh, there's so much more. One of the things I found interesting that is just before this discussion that Jesus had been in the temple with his disciples and he made this statement in Matthew 24 verse 2. Do you see all these things? He asked. I tell you the truth. Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. Well, did this actually happen? Yes, it did. In 70 AD. When the Romans under Titus completely destroyed Jerusalem and the temple buildings. Excavations in 1968 actually uncovered large numbers of these stones toppled from the walls by the invaders. It seems to me that giving his followers such a concrete prophecy was just one way of helping them to believe that all he would say to them about the end of the age would also come to pass. Before I go into a discussion and overview of what those living in the last days can expect to see, I'd like to share with you 4 parables that reinforce Jesus' message that we are to be ever watchful. Why? Because he says, we do not know on what day the Lord will come. He gives examples to help us to be ever ready. First, he goes to the situation of those living in Noah's day. We see that in Matthew 24:37-39. You see, God was finished with their evil ways and had found only one family who would be saved in the ark from the flood that he would bring upon the earth at that time. Jesus reminds the listeners that in that day, people were going about their business, eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. In other words, totally unaware of what was coming. This is how it will be when Jesus returns again to our world. Life will be going on with most people totally unaware of the situation and the danger ahead. No wonder he says in verse 42, therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. Secondly, in verse 43, he says something I think we can all agree with. If the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have left his house be broken into. Therefore, Jesus says in verse 34, "So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him." Third, in verses 45 to 51, we hear a warning as it relates to a servant who had been left in charge of his master's family to take care of them while he is away. But suppose that servant is wicked and disobedient and neglects and abuses them, thinking, "Oh, well, the master is away a long time. I can do as I please." Again, we hear Jesus' warning in verse 50. "The master of the servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he is not aware of. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." It sounds pretty dire, doesn't it? No wonder Jesus warns us in so many ways to be ready. And fourth, we hear the parable of the 10 virgins, or another term used, bridesmaids, in chapter 25, verse 1 to 13. 5, the wise ones, always had their lamps filled with oil and were ready. And 5, the foolish ones, weren't prepared. The picture is that they are waiting for the bridegroom, Jesus' return. He comes for his bride when they don't expect him. Matter of fact, it says he was a long time in coming. And yes, the 5 wise virgins were ready and were taken into the wedding banquet. But the 5 foolish virgins were told in verse 12, when they were begging to have the door opened for them, the bad news: "I tell you the truth, I don't know you." Again we hear, "Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour." For all of us, I think these situations are put here to remind us that even though it has been almost 2,000 years since Jesus shared these signs of his return, we must not let our guard down. We must not end up like those in Noah's day, or the owner of the house that was unprepared for the arrival of the thief, or the disobedient servant thinking his master was not coming back, or the 5 foolish virgins who missed out on entering the wedding banquet. We must be ever watchful, because we do not know the day or the hour. Now let's actually look at the signs of that return and some of the teaching that go along with them. First, we hear of signs found in all 3 Gospels that Jesus describes as the beginning of birth pains. Deceivers will come professing to be the Christ. There will be wars and revolutions and rumors of wars. Nations will rise against nations and kingdoms against kingdoms. Great famines, earthquakes, and pestilences in various places. Fearful events and great signs from heaven. You may say that these things have been happening for years, and that would be true. That's what he meant when he said, "All these are the beginning of birth pains." Matthew 24:8 says, "I would suggest that as the time gets closer to his return, those signs will become more pronounced and will come closer and closer together, just as birth pains do, as they lead up to the birth of a baby." Then he goes on to tell us that many followers will be persecuted and actually put to death, that Christians will be hated by all nations, and many believers will fall away from their faith, deceived by false prophets, actually leading them to hate one another. However, there is one sign that Jesus shares that's very clear in 24 verse 14 of Matthew. "And the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." That would mean to me that as long as there are places where this hasn't happened, the end will not come. Some expositors believe that the end referred to here relates to the time when the temple is destroyed, while others believe, as I do, that the end referred to here is the end of the age, which is still ahead of us. I've decided to take the section referring to the signs I just talked about and prepare next week's message dealing with the history of such things as earthquakes and famines and pestilences and wars and rumors of wars, and etc., from Jesus' time to today, to see if there has truly been an escalation. I'll also share what I've been able to find out concerning how close we are to the gospel of the kingdom being preached in the whole world. But for now, I'd like to read to you from Matthew chapter 24, verses 15 to 35, as it was the closing of Jesus' teaching on the section focusing on signs, and I think directs us to see that his return will be very visible, and there will be no question whether or not it's actually him. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof of his house go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get his cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Christ," or "There he is," do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles, to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. See, I have told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, "There he is, out in the desert," do not go out. Or "Here he is in the inner rooms," do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Whenever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Wow, what a passage. I could prepare an entire video just looking at it in detail. But today, let me point out a few terms that actually show us how distressing this time will be. Verse 15 mentions we are to be watchful, for something detestable will be standing in the holy place. And when he does, all those in Judea should head for the mountains. Why? Because as it says in verse 21, there will be great distress, or another translation refers to it as great tribulation. Verse 23 reminds us not to be fooled by false Christs or false prophets during that time, for they will try and deceive many by saying, "Look, here is the Christ," or "There he is." And Jesus tells us, do not believe it. So how will we know when it's really him? Well, verses 27 to 31 point out what to expect when it is truly the Lord returning. His return will be visible to the whole world, just as lightning comes from the east is visible in the west. Immediately after the distress or the tribulation that I mentioned earlier, there will be signs in the heavenlies. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies, or the planets, will be shaken. All nations will see his coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. No mistaking, it's Jesus. He will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and those who are ready, who are believers, will be gathered up by the angels from all over the world and taken to Jesus. The next passage gives us another sign, the fig tree, that most commentators explain refers to the nation of Israel and the rebirth of Israel in 1948. I would think that the reason there's so much discussion around this event and what has transpired ever since that time as it relates to Israel makes sense. That's why I want to close our time together on this note. He gives us what many consider a time frame from that event, that the generation following 1948 will not pass away until all these things have happened. A generation is quite often deemed to be 70 years or so. That would include me. How about you? He wraps up his teaching on signs. When you see all these things, you know it is near, right at the door. I hope that you've been encouraged once again with the good news of Jesus' soon return. From my perspective, it helps me understand and cope with all the chaos going on around us. In one of my future videos, when we move into the book of Revelation, we'll see how God has a plan. And one day, the Garden of Eden will return. And what a blessing that will be. Please remember to comment, share this video with friends, and subscribe to this channel. I can't tell you how much it encourages me to see there are people who are being blessed by this channel. God bless, and see you next week.